So far, we talk a great deal about those topics, those issues that are important to us. That is to say, we raise various questions in different fields of knowledge. And largely, we raise them in terms of how they either represent or misrepresent the truth as we know it and think it to be. Mostly, of course, we raise it in oppositional ways in terms of its neglect of African people, or furthermore, its negation of African people in history and in society. But what we tend not to do sufficiently enough, that is to look at the basis of what we call what we know. That is, how do you come to know what it is you say you know? What is what you say is? How do you come to formulate the question? And what does your question represent? So we, in that sense, would be considering, I suppose, what social scientists, if we were to take their vocabulary, would be the sociology of knowledge. That is the study of the process of knowledge in society. Because, you see, before we come to study something, it has already been established as a process in society. So in one respect, we're going to look at the social constructs of knowledge. Consider the reality principle from which theoretical concepts and other humanistic notions arise. Not only do theoretical concepts come from a given set of assumptions about reality, they of course come to represent reality. So we see, for example, before us a few weeks ago, they talked about something called smart bombs. See, we didn't deconstruct that. What is a bomb? And then furthermore, what is smart? And so most of us missed when they reported recently that 70% of those bombs missed their target. They argued, of course, that less than 25% of those bombs are on target. And there's been very little debate about how it is that there was no critical consideration of all that was being talked about relative to that conflict in the Middle East. All ideas, all systems of learning and knowledge have historical and cultural origin. The base of academic disciplines that we say we're trained in come from historical and cultural context. And so we need to begin ourselves to look at the base of knowledge, the base of ideas. And then, of course, we need, in Africana studies, to begin to construct, therefore, our own theoretical base, our own theoretical systems, and also methodological systems. So we will, of course, therefore, be looking at this issue of knowledge and learning and knowing. I'd like, of course, first of all, to introduce to you our first speaker, who is, of course, no stranger to you at this point. She is, of course, the president of the African Heritage Studies Association, Dr.Charshee McIntyre. But perhaps you don't know her in her most prominent role. That is a role as a university professor. She teaches at Old Westbury of the State University of New York system. She has been an educator there and has been, of course, foremost an educator. Her role as president of the African Heritage Studies Association has allowed us to have the benefit of her insight in guiding this organization. But this evening, she will present some ideas and an analysis of the epistemology of Afrocentricity. And so I'd like you all to welcome her first to the podium, and then we will proceed. We will proceed now with the evening's program. Dr. Charshee McIntyre.
Hotep, Abarigani, Assalamu alaikum, peace unto you, my brothers and sisters. I am standing in for J. Carruthers and Hunter Adams, but we need the female principal anyway.
That's real.
Okay?
That's real.
A few years ago, Dr. Turner wrote a fantastic chapter in a book called The Next Decade. And if it's out there, you need to get it, and if it's not, you need to send for it to Cornell. And in that first chapter is an explication of Africana epistemology. Epistemology means the way we know something. And from that time, you know, Malana, Malefi, Jake Carruthers and others, and myself have been dealing with world perspectives. I have done the three world, African, Native American, and European worldviews. And I have a couple of papers on it, and with my partner, Doug Davison, we have done quite a few workshops in Atlanta, South Carolina, New York, different places. And it really makes a difference. You can, as James has introduced the idea, you can take some knowledge that you have whatever, in your head, situated in your head, and then when you take an Afrocentric approach, when you begin to look at it like, what I mean by Afrocentric at this particular moment is from a reality rather than from a theoretical frame of reference. You know, we get all these damn degrees and we forget how much we have absorbed. So I want to take you on a little trip. I identify myself as an African Native American. I have two wonderful African Native Americans, Kyle and KG McIntyre, stand up. That two African warriors that my husband and I produced. You will notice wise woman has first son looks just like husband. My husband's Jamaican, and he's always telling me he's pure African, and I'm mixed, you know, and I have this and all that kind of stuff. And I have dealt in AHSA a long time with this connection, the African Native American connection, and the time has come. We have arrived at recognizing that connection. And of course, it's an autobiographical trip, because one wants to be what one is, and one wants to know what that is. But then when we listen to James and John and Dr. Ben and all this unveiling of knowledge that we all came from Africa, then you begin to deal with how did we come from Africa, you know, in reality, how did we get here, not just on the slave ship, okay? And let me just, I usually have a map, but all of you put the map of the world in your mind. You got that? You got the map of the world in your mind. And we are here in the United States. We are here in the Western Hemisphere. And as we move into 1992, we have been told that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and the definitive analysis of the peopling of this hemisphere is to justify that lie, that Columbus or Leif Erikson or some European discovered this land, okay? James talked about the assumptions that we have, and we think that we're Afrocentric, and we think we're not walking around with assumptions. But the basic assumption for the peopling of the world is that humanity starts in the interlacustrine region, that area around the Old Divide Gorge and the equator, right in the center of Africa. right? You know what I'm saying? In the Olduvai Gorge, where humanity starts at the beginning of the Nile, right? And then you come down the Nile, because of course you know the Nile flows up, or if you put the map correctly and put Africa where it should be on the top of the world, then the Nile would flow down. But because you're looking at a European world, they put Europe with this little small appendage of Asia in some kind of dominant spot, and we begin to think that Europe is really above Africa. But if you get out in space, you will discover it's hard to find Europe, and Africa is a monstrous place, right? Because we are taught to look at the world as if north is above us, but the oldest and longest and most dominant river in the world begins in the center, begins at the equator, and flows down to Europe. That's the reality. Isn't that the reality? You can't swim against the current, and it's the longest river in the world. It's 4,000 miles long. But if you go the other way, as Cato will tell you, there is a waterway that will take you all the way down to South Africa. But they don't want you to know this great waterway exists. Now, humanity starts their little black pygmoid, excuse the expression, but I want to give you a visualization. Pygmoid, little black pygmoid, small people with strong black bodies, nappy hair, steatopisia butts, right? Because the critical question is, how did white people lose their behind? But we won't do that tonight. I've asked John, he's working on it. Let's start with the prototype human being. It's a small, black, tropical person on the equator. Comes down the Nile and turns into a tall, brown-skinned person with maybe sharp features, and the hair's getting a little different, right? And then migrates out, goes to Europe, spends 100,000 years in the ice, loses its pigmentation, the curl in its hair, its butt, etc., right? Mixes, goes over to Asia, creates half the people in the world. They're all yellow with slanted eyes, straight hair, buttless totally, come across the Siberian, Bering Strait, listen to me, come across the Siberian, Bering Strait, turn into little fat round Inuits, what we call Eskimos, with an extra layer of fat, right? That's the progression. Comes in waves of 30, this is what they tell you. Look in Peoples of Africa by Time Life. Comes in waves of 30 people at a time. And by the time Columbus gets over here, he discovers, or it discovers him, 210 million people over here that have come and populated this place in bands of 30 people. That's what they tell you. You look at any map of migration, you look at any first course in anthropology, and they will tell you that's how they people this hemisphere. Now, let's check this out in the reality and the assumption. They not only came here as little Eskimos, little fat people, but then they started migrating south, right? So then they changed into brown people, they changed their phenotype, and then they changed into tall people, and then by the time they get to the equator, they are now back to little short, pygmoid, nappy-haired, strong Africans. You believe that? You believe that? They not only changed phenotype on a trip down, but culture. You believe that? Do you believe that the first place, do you believe 210 million people were here in 1492? Do you believe that 12.5 million people were here in what is called the United States? No, because somebody told you there was a vast wasteland. Now, what you do, the scholar Dobbins, what you do is begin to take the church's records and look at how many Native Americans they wiped out. Because, you know, the church, which was busy trying to change us, kept a very definitive record of how successful they were at massacring the indigenous people here. Verrazano, in his diary, very carefully documented the phenotypes of the people here from Central America up through Nova Scotia, where my father's people come from the Ethiopian-looking people in Florida to the light Eskimo-type people in Nova Scotia. So we know what the people look like here. Now, why do they tell you that there's only one road to this hemisphere? Think about it. 100,000 years in the Ice Age. They're telling you that original people left the equator, tropical people stayed 100,000 years in the Ice Age, then came out and started migrating, came over here and quote unquote reverted back into tropical people. Rather than tell you that, as we heard early this morning, in the oceanic belt of the equator, what do you see? Little black people here, little black people here, little black people here, little black people. But did they go that way? No, anthropology tells you they all went up to Siberia because they want to say the European was the first person to cross the Atlantic Ocean, right? That is what they want you to understand. Now, how difficult is it to get across the Atlantic Ocean? The second theory of diffusion of people is that, well, maybe they didn't just come through the Bering Straits. Maybe they went across the Indian Ocean, which is twice as wide as the Atlantic, or the Pacific, which is 3 times as wide as the Atlantic, rather than say Africans left the equator belt of Africa and went right across the Atlantic to Brazil, right? That's where most of the people are. There is no archaeological evidence to suggest that they came down, and there are no 25,000 or 30,000-year-old fossils in Canada. They're in Central America, so they disappeared, their bones disappeared along the way. Rather than tell you they came across the ocean. How difficult is it to get across the Atlantic Ocean? When Admiral Cabral, again another European who discovered Brazil according to Caminha, C-A-M-I-N-H-A, in the diary written at the time, because I like to read the diaries written at the time, they were trying to skirt the Congo River. You know the Congo River right outside of Africa? Central, right near the equator. They were trying to skirt the Congo River. They were in the Atlantic Ocean trying to skirt the turbulence coming out of the Congo River and got blown across the Atlantic. That's how difficult it is to get across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if you read Ivan Van Sertima, you'll see all these currents. There's a book, I have it in my pocketbook, by Thor Heyerdahl, who then created a reed ship and showed you how easy it is to get across the Atlantic. Now, reeds are just paper, but Europeans didn't know that Africans, ancient Egyptians, were wise enough to actually make all kinds of boats that could go across the ocean. They knew all this kind of technology. So what they did, to get back to the concept of epistemology, was to tell you this hemisphere, North and South and Central America, developed in isolation to the rest of the world. Isn't that what they tell you? They tell you the migration only came through the Siberian Strait, and then people reverted into these phenotypes. These are assumptions we're accepting to keep the idea that there is only one way to get here. Now, here's the second thing. In Egypt, you have pyramids. The Nile was wet 7,000, 9,000 years BC. It was wet. And then it dried up around 4,000 BC, and people dispersed, if you read Sheikh Anta Diop. Now, here's another example of this non-migratory around the equator. You have pyramids in Egypt. You have pyramids in West Africa. And you have pyramids in Central America. You have those great big thick-lipped, big-nosed megaliths in the Ivory Coast. And you have them in the Olmec civilization here. But did they cross the ocean? No, because Columbus discovered America. So, so when you read the explanation for the divine kingship in Central America, that is the same as in Egypt or Kemet, that is the same as we heard this morning in the Ivory Coast in West Africa. And Len Jeffries can tell you in the Ivory Coast, I believe it is, they found 100 of those megalith heads. This brother who put out the gold weights. Now, here we have all this evidence. Irrefutable evidence. Pyramids here, pyramids here, pyramids here. Big stone heads here, big stone heads here, big stone heads here. All African. But is this a diffusion of culture? No, no, this is parallel development. We all thought of it at the same time, rather than say Africans came across the ocean. Now, we sit around, I know most of you sit around and say, that's kind of sophisticated. It's not. They tell us so many lies. We say Africans invented civilization. I accept that. That's my first premise. And so when I see civilization, I look for the diffusion of an African reality. If you see the ancient god of Vietnamese, he's black. The ancient god of Hawaiians, he's black. The ancient god of the Indians, Vishnu, is black. The ancient god of Chinese, Buddha, is black. Are these Africans? No, European will tell you this is parallel development. And we sit around and accept this because he wants to develop his concept of white supremacy, and if he wasn't there first, then it didn't happen. Now, when we talk about Africana epistemology, we have to talk about if what we know is true. And how can we know whether what we know is true if we don't start from a basis of reality? If everything around the equatorial belt is black and black culture and tropical people, why? How can we possibly believe that they went all the way up through Siberia and then dispersed? You understand what I'm saying? What is the purpose? What is the purpose of such a stupid interpretation of the dissemination of humanity? That is how deep white supremacy goes. You understand what I'm saying? That's how deep it goes. Now, that's just one insight I got. And what it does for me, it's very easy for me to trace my African ancestry back to the origins of humanity, and equally easy for me to trace my Native American ancestry down to the equator and over again. You understand what I'm saying? Now, the last thing I want to say, because I always start with my husband, who is the half that makes me whole, the totality of my human reality, who helped me bring forth two African warriors. But we get to arguing about this whole concept of race because we talk about it. The myths about the Native Americans are so deep, and the myths about who we are as African Americans are so deep that many times we are afraid to investigate them. So let me just share this last insight from this book, The Only Land They Knew. The Only Land They Knew. And another book, Indian Givers. And The Only Land They Knew, they talk about after Columbus invaded and destroyed the people in Jamaica, in the West Indies. They had many fights in the 16th and 17th century in what is now North America. They always killed most of the men, and they shipped the women and the children to the West Indies. Some 60,000 or more in the 16th, 17th century. And the original Africans that they sent over from West Africa were disproportionately male. So from the very beginning of that interaction, there is an interconnection between the African and the Native American, from the very beginning. And why that worked was because those two worldviews, the ancient African worldview, the traditional African worldview, and the African and Native American worldview were very much the same. Very much the same, because they started from the same base. Now, people say, well, so did the European worldview start from the same base. But if you read Michael Bradley's The Iceman Inheritance, and if you read Sheikh Anta Diop, you will know that you cannot stay 100,000 years in a cave, in an ice age, and come out with a tropical mentality.